use, which is at the bottom of the screen there. Please just send through your questions throughout the session, and I'll obviously deal with it and interrupt at the appropriate moments to get as much information out of our guests today as possible. Then just in terms of the agenda, we're sticking to an hour. That's the timing that we're looking at. I'll shortly be handing over to Louis, who will give us an overview for 20 minutes or so about his special place in the Southern Rhône and the wines of Château Saint-Côme. And then he'll hand the baton over to the small chap that's on your screen there, David Sadie in the Swartland. He'll then take us through his philosophy for 20 minutes, and that'll leave us with a little session at the end with some questions and answers. So Louis, it's great to see you again. I think when I started preparing for today and looking forward to it, we actually first met in 2008 when I was still working for Mark and Rupert at Decorum in London, and they kindly packed me in their suitcase and took me over, and we had a very special moment and afternoon at your winery and getting exposed to your wines and the soil and the terroir. And then we've obviously been lucky enough to have a few visits over the years while we've been importing your wine. And we always leave the visit with lots of enthusiasm, laced with lots of humor and lots of knowledge and intelligence. So we really appreciate your time in joining us today. And we look forward to what you have to say. And then, as I say, shortly after that, we'll hand over to David. So welcome, Louis, and please, fire away.
Okay, thank you, Derek. I will maybe talk, we should maybe talk not too quickly because there is a slight delay with the connection. So good, hello everyone. Very happy to talk directly to the South Africans, amateurs of Rhône Valley wines, Rhône Valley grapes, and obviously South Africans wines grown with Grenache and Rhône Valley grapes. I'm sure it's going to be a really nice time to spend there and talk and exchange ideas. Really nice to be two of us, since it's probably richer in terms of information and what we can share. To re-give you a sense of context. We are in the Southern Rhône, in a village called Gigondas, which is just 15 km from Château. We talk about tempered Mediterranean climate. We will maybe talk more about that with David later, but Mediterranean climate doesn't mean much, since people tend to put many different things in the same basket. Our climate is a little hot, but not crazy hot, and we get 760 millimeters, and we get water through the summer. So it's quite tempered. It's not crazy dry. It's relatively dry, but not mad. So Saint-Côme is an ancient estate which has been in our family since the 15th century, and our main job is Gigondas wine. Obviously, this is the historical vineyard and estate, and we are located in this very protected, very small. We talk about small scale viticulture. It's more like than and about us is probably my father,
Louis, you seem to have broken up. I don't know if you're moving, but it's broken up completely. Are you back with us?
Our vineyards,
Louis?
We've lost him.
So for those of you that are watching, you might think that some people might say, why is the connection not working? So we are very specific that we do a proper test 24 hours before, for the exact reason that we know that the connectivity is sufficient and working, which as luck would have it, it was working 24 hours ago. And so I'm not sure where Louis has gone. So that's obviously thrown a little curveball. So I'm sure he will rejoin us in a second. So we might have to, David, yeah, as I say, while we wait for him to re-log on, I just see that you mentioned, or you showed us earlier, you proudly lifted up some Sancombe bottles. Have you been to the estate before, and how familiar are you with Louis' wines?
No, I haven't been to the estate. I've just been collecting them for the last couple of years, and the idea was to be, I would have been there in May, past May, but my complete European trip has been postponed. So I hope to visit Louis and a few other producers next year in May.
Okay, well, no, thanks. Let me just check here, because I see Louis back on the screen. Louis, can you hear us? Louis? All right. Let me, Christopher, if you are listening, if you can maybe just send Louis a message in the chat for him to maybe just interrupt David and I when he has the connectivity back. And then if Christine, if you're listening, if you can also maybe just give him a call on the phone. So David and I are going to carry on. And then as soon as Louis is back, we'll rope him in. David, yeah, so, I mean, Louis, I think, yeah, we've been working with his wines for the last 10 years. And I think the big thing for us was to get the two of you on the same platform. I mean, outside of all the other grape varieties, I think the obvious sort of big connection for me and for us is Grenache. And in terms of what that grape can and does yield in Château and Gigondas and those places in the Southern Rhône, it's just interesting to, I suppose, to compare what's happening there versus what you're trying to, and what you are achieving there in the Swartlands. And I'm not sure how many people are aware of the project that you've got going on, I don't want to say on the side, that you've got going, which is all your potential single vineyards. I hope I'm not spoiling the secret there, but it might be interesting maybe just to elaborate and tell everyone, we've got lots of our friends and customers watching, just what the plans are for that grape variety within your portfolio of wines over the next few years.
Sure. Thank you, Derek. And yeah, good afternoon to everyone. I think, first of all, one feels quite small and quite, we've got a very short history in terms of Grenache. If you just heard what Louis said, the farm has been in, I think, for almost 400 or 500 years in the family. Grenache in Spain and France has been there since the 13th century. So in our country, we've only seen Grenache late 1800s, early 1900s. And there's a couple of interesting stories around Grenache, which I'd quickly like to share. There's two theories as to how Grenache got into our country. The first is from a guy that traveled from Perpignan. He was called James Busby, and he was traveling to Australia actually to take Grenache clones, and allegedly stopped in Cape Town and left cuttings behind. So that was the one, let's say, the theory around 1832. And then the other theory was Napoleon that drank, as they called it Citrus dal Chianti, which was
I've never heard of that, huh?
he drank that in his stay, which was during exile and on Saint Helena Island, around 1815 to 1821. He was drinking Chianti, or Citrus del Chianti, which was described as soft, pale-colored, gentle tannins, and some wine that could have that aged and matured quite well. So those two are the two, let's say, theories around Grenache history. And then the legend, Professor Perrault confirmed in 1904, some studies say 1907, he confirmed that the Grenache or Garnacha that he himself brought in from Spain was matching Montpellier's the French clone, and was also matching the local plantings as indeed being Grenache. So it's been around for a few years, but I mean, if you take Australia, if you take California, if you take Spain in a way, but most of those countries basically had an influx and a huge growth rate in terms of Grenache plantings. But most of the other countries that I've just mentioned, like California and Australia, the wines went either for fortification or for sweet jug wines, as they called it. And when the guys basically decided to make more still wines, they basically left Grenache behind. And then also those governments subsidized an uprooting or an uprooting scheme where from the 60s up to late 90s, even 2000s, a lot of Grenache got ripped out because it was basically cheap and cheerful, overcropping, bad status, not a good reputation. And then in the 19s, Bordeaux varieties and Syrah, as an example, took over because it became quite fashionable. One can argue and say that it's due to Parker that made those grapes fashionable. And then in each of those countries, some guys basically rescued Grenache in a way. We've obviously seen the Old Vine Project in our country. Eben Sadie, Rosa Creer, the Ruperts, they've rescued Grenache. Arie Badenhorst, our neighbor, he's got one of the oldest planting. So having old vines is quite a luxury in our country because it fell out of fashion. In our country in the 90s, in theory, the guys wanted to make pitch black, dark, extracted wines. I'm not dismissing the style, I'm just saying it as it is for the history of it. And you can't do that with a lighter pigment variety. And if you take something like Cinsault back in the probably 70s, when they used to classify wines according to a superior system or not, blindly they basically tasted a Cinsault, and the guy said that they need to call this a superior wine. And then when they revealed the cultivar being Cinsault, they said there's no way that we can classify a Cinsault as superior. So these lighter pigment varieties were basically dismissed. They weren't given the true, let's say, recognition and credit of the past. It was more the Cabernets and Pinotage in our country, obviously, that took the leading role, at least from the 60s and onwards. So that was quite an interesting part of our history in our country. The similarities of...
David, just a quick one from Angela Lloyd, who's just popped me a message to say that the Citrus del Chianti was still around in the 70s and 80s, and she's drunk a fair few bottles. So thanks,
I need to go and visit her for that story.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just test again. Louis, can you maybe hear us? I can see you on the screen. Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me? I can really hear you.
There we go. That's nice and clear.
Sorry about that.
No problem. We were just talking behind your back, talking about the French rugby team. So it was a good time for you to go off. So listen, Louis, there we go. Full marks. David, if you're okay, I'll maybe just hand the baton back to Louis.
Yeah.
Then we can the agenda and hopefully the connectivity works. So Louis, please carry on. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so sorry about the bad connection. I was just explaining how important is the organic agriculture, obviously, and the old vines. On top of that, Saint-Côme is a really cold corner with elevation, and it faces north-northwest. So it explains a lot about why our Gigondas are really different from most of others, as they carry this finesse and this really good freshness, given that we act in a southern Rhône climate environment. What you see now on the screen is a Château de Rouen. This is a a property that we purchased last year. This is a fantastic, another historical property in Vin Sobre. I don't know if you are familiar with Vin Sobre, which became a cru in 2006. It's a really extraordinary area, very under-recognized. And can we go back to the previous picture, maybe? We went for it because, thank you, because the terroir potential is truly extraordinary, and our first vintage 2019 showed pretty impressive wine. So this is beginning again what I began in 1992 with Saint-Cosme. At age 51, I am redoing the exact same story, which is nice. I mean, it makes me think that I am younger than I am really. So it's an idea. But yeah, so when you come in springtime, David, we will have a tour of this place, which is a totally different scale. It's much bigger than Saint-Cosme. It's a very different soil and environment, but really fantastic. It's really just 5 km from the beginning of the Alps, so it gets a really very cold influence from the mountains. It's really interesting.
Louis, just quickly, you obviously can't sit still, and you are very dynamic in terms of what you've done at Saint-Cosme. And obviously, if some people aren't maybe aware of what you've done in America, in Finger Lakes with Riesling and Pinot Noir, and now this new project in Vin Sobre, why was it this particular area as opposed to any other of the surrounding appellations? How did you end up specifically getting to Vin Sobre and to this estate? Was something particular?
This is a long story. The owner and myself, same age, have been friends since we were 15 years old, same school. And when I began to buy more and more grapes for the négoce side of the cellar, I began to buy them a lot of grapes. So it's been 15 years that I buy a lot of grapes from this place. Okay. And so I was given to know this terroir really extremely well. And 2 years ago, they told me we are going to sell the estate because there was major conflicts in the family. And they said, we would give you priority, but if you don't want it, we would sell it anyway. And frankly, I couldn't leave this place go in other hands. It appeared to me very impossible. So it was a big decision, but I think a good decision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So coming back to Gigondas a little bit, obviously we cultivate mostly Grenache, but Syrah and Mourvèdre as well. But Grenache in Saint-Cosme is, yeah, okay, this is a good view of the Dentelle de Montmirail, which is pure limestone mountains, which broke the geological cake from underneath and made our place specific, since all this soil that you see are limestone emarl from Tortonian. And this is the exact same soil that you find in Barolo and Barbaresco. Tortonian comes from a village of Piemonte called Tortona. And we have the privilege to share the same soils. And this is really interesting on very old vines, like when the wines are 20, 25 years old, there is an aromatic spectrum which reminds of Barolo with the Saint-Cosme wines, and it comes from the terroir, not obviously the grapes. But you know, I've always thought that terroir counts a lot more than grapes. Obviously, you want to cultivate the right grape at the right place, but as the wines age, the grapes' characteristics tend to disappear and get dominated by the soil characters. So we make Northern Rhône wines as well. Since 1997, we make Côte Rôtie and Condrieu mostly, just because I am a deep lover of these areas. So yeah, it's a lot of work, obviously, but as projects come in, you get the right organization, but it really works.
Louis, one little interruption again on this picture. Everyone always discusses the differences with regards to your neighbors in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Gigondas. And everyone, you know, the whole thing is similar soil, similar climates. Is, in your view, it's probably a long discussion, but in a simplistic, if it's possible to be simplistic, would you say that the mountain range in terms of probably allowing Gigondas to ripen slightly later in terms of stylistically, do you think that that's one of the main differences between the two appellations, or is it a lot more complicated than that?
Well, there's a lot more differences than common points. I think the only point that we have in common with Châteauneuf is the grapes we cultivate, which are the same. But a part of that, it's all different. Châteauneuf was generated by the Rhône River. So you talk about Villafranchienne terraces. This is ancient alluvions who formed the hills. So this is a lot of clay and rounded stones. You talk about 300,000 years ago, which is very recent in the geological times. In Gigondas, our soils were generated in the Miocene times, so 11 millions. It's based on limestone mostly. We have elevation 280 meters. They are 130. We face north-northwest. They are relatively flat. There is no really exposure. So obviously you harvest in Châteauneuf around the 15-20 of September. I harvest between the 5 and the 10 of October. So that's 3 weeks difference for ripening, which is absolutely massive. It means that I get a lot of cold nights, which doesn't really exist anymore in Châteauneuf. So obviously the profile of the Grenache are very, very, very different.
Awesome. Thanks, Louis.
So to keep going a little bit about what we do, we are non-interventionist farmers and winemakers. It doesn't mean that we don't work. we work a lot, but we want to do things on a very simple and respectful way. For example, in the cellar, this is full stems. We are a full bunches winery. Not a single grape is destemmed at Saint-Cosme. We use indigenous yeast, obviously. The wines are unfiltered. They are never racked. So it would be difficult to go more simple. But I have discovered over the years that this is more difficult to do nice products on a very simple way than using many techniques to get a result. I mean, we should always compare winemaking to gastronomy. The key of quality is the product, and if you can have a great material and do very few on it, this is what you want to do in gastronomy, and this is what you want to do in viticulture. But that means that well, organic viticulture, you don't have much products to fight mildew and powdery mildew. You need predators for the worms. You need to solve many issues, and you have to face challenges with less tools than conventional. So it's actually not very easy. But when you can do the viticulture this way, it's a great satisfaction. I mean, it's a really nice achievement to go this way, and yeah, it's really important. I mean, life is too short to make things on an average way.
And there was a picture now there on the screen, Louis, of that very young cellar of yours. I think only from the 11th century, I think.
No, this part of the cellar is used for the whites and for the Côte du Rhône, the basic Côte du Rhône blendings and bottlings. That's more of all the place in the cellar. But you know, in Saint-Côme, there is nothing between the 16th century and the 20th century. So it's either very old or very recent. But the recent cellars are not used for the great wines. All the great wines are made in concrete, fermented in concrete, and aged in the old cellars. So stained steel is for white and very simple red. But I'm not a great believer of stained steel for great red wines, especially Grenache. I think Grenache doesn't like much stained steel. Not because I am over traditional, because I tried everything. I am crazy with experimentations. We keep experimenting many things every year, and this is just the results that we get, and it happens that it is traditional, because most traditional ideas are good ideas. Not all of them, but I would say most of them.
And Louis, your son James, right? How old is he now?
James is now 23.
So he's not the little James anymore.
No, he's pretty really strong scrum half, but I mean a modern scrum half, not 70s scrum half. You see, no, he's a proper adult. He's just graduated from university in politics and Spanish, and we'll see what happens with him in the future. But I have two daughters as well who have potential. So I hope the story of Saint-Côme will keep going after me. Yeah, frankly, yes.
Well, I feel Louis, they've probably got, there shouldn't be too much choice, because what is it now, 15 generations, it can't stop.
Well, I want to make them think that they have choice. But it's a kind of a lie.
No, I mean, James is 23, which I'm sure it was the exact age you were when you took over in 92 from Henri.
Exactly. And with a lot of responsibilities, because the situation of the estate was very, very difficult. My father was, half of his body was paralyzed at the time because he had a stroke in 1990. So we had to work several years. He would be the mind, and I would be the arms and the legs. But it was a pretty fantastic period of time, very tough, but very rich in terms of our relationship.
Yeah, and there were big changes because I think, if I remember correctly, there was quite a lot of grapes that were maybe sold off in bulk, if I'm not mistaken, and you really focused things and made some positive changes for the future.
Yeah, it was a very paradoxical situation. Saint-Côme was a very significant ancient historical estate with a fantastic terroir, but we would not even exist on the map of the world of wine, because my father used to sell in bulk to Marcel Guigal and to Burgundian merchants. Yeah, a lot of the Saint-Côme wines finished their lives in Burgundy in the past.
Crazy,
Yeah,
crazy,
yeah.
crazy.
We don't know why, but we do know why. And yes, so everything had to be done, but we had the great material, which is the most important.
Yeah.
If you have that, you can go and fight and go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, Louis, it's amazing what you've achieved in actually in a relatively short space of time. So we are very proud and happy to be representing your wines in South Africa. So thanks very much.
Thanks. It's wonderful.
So Louis, I'm just obviously managing the time, and then I'm just going to maybe hand over to David to give a bit of a overview of what's happening in the Swartland in South Africa. And please don't hesitate to try and catch him out on any of the incorrect facts that he might be telling our customers and friends. So please don't hesitate. And yeah, please obviously interrupt and interact wherever possible. And then, yeah, David, please carry on, and welcome and thanks again.
Nice.
Big pleasure. Thanks, Louis. It's really interesting and fascinating to hear your story. So yeah, basically, just at the moment, we're setting about, I think, 350 hectares of Grenache in our country, which is quite small. Most of it is the Swartland, Paarl, and Citrusdal Mountains, Pieterneerkloof. And it's been only the last 21 odd years that it's been revived and looked after again. And thanks to a group of legend winemakers such as Neil Ellis and Jan Boland Coetzee. And it was actually Jan Boland Coetzee's Grenache that made me get inspiration for making Grenache, for tasting his wines, and then eventually setting up a cellar next to his son-in-law in the Paardenberg. I never knew that was going to happen. But it was from drinking Citrusdal Mountain Grenache during studies and thereafter what made me actually realize that Grenache is our main focus. I grew up in this region, and I've made wines across the world and in other regions in our country, and it was always Syrah that was the leading inspirational wine for us. And also we assumed that when we come back to the Swartland, eventually it had to be Syrah for us as well, which in the beginning it was, until we started working with our own Grenache in 2011. We bottled actually one little barrel separately, and then followed a couple of years of intense drought in the Swartland from 16 up to 2019. And we saw how Grenache reacted on the droughts, and we realized eventually that Grenache needs to be our main focus. So we've moved over from originally the Alpidios being Syrah based to eventually it being Grenache based in 2017. So that's the current vintage we've released for the very first time based on Alpidios, based on Grenache. And then we've grown our main Grenache bottling as well. It's up to about 6,500 bottles. And on the Chenin side, we've started with single vineyards in 2014, and it will be the dream to release maybe from 2019, 20, 21, also single vineyard Grenache. That's leading up for the future. It will be 2 vineyards, one altitude focused granite, which is the Paardenberg mountain. And then the other mountain is the Kasteelberg, which is a lot of sandstone, but predominantly schist-driven mountain. And that's also a new vineyard that we planted and started farming in 2016. I mean, I think in our country we have about 10 hectares of old vines left. And if your surname is not Badenhorst or Coetzee or Rupert, you don't have access to those grapes. So we had to start from young vines, early 2000s planted, mostly granite, some clay. And then we had to invest in planting for the future. So at the moment we work with 5 vineyards, all registered single vineyards. Probably 2, maybe 3 of them will be bottled separately eventually. But the idea is to make what do you call it, an appellation wine, a Swartland Grenache, like we do on the Chenin. It's a Chenin based on multiple vineyards from one appellation. And from our very young context in terms of the Swartland and call it the Cape, we need to still establish those geographical indications around the world before we can bottle very specific single vineyards. That's why we would always have a firm foundation of about 75% of our production being based on Swartland as an appellation from multiple vineyards within one appellation, but always based on granite, which is the Paardeberg, and that is where we're based. And then obviously we've started the venture of doing cruise, or we've done single vineyards. And then the next step would be to do single vineyard Grenache bottlings. Really, my boys are 4 or 5 and 7 years old, so it's a couple of years before they can take over. But I also need to make them believe that it was their decision if they want to take over. But it's obviously what you have to do. You have to plan for the future. So that's what we've done. And eventually we'll reap the fruit from it. And that specific photo, that's 2017 planted Grenache. Most of the Grenaches are planted northeast, not northwest. So it's a little bit of a diurnal shift that we try to increase on that way. pH levels, something very interesting we've seen this year, being a good vintage in terms of yields, but being quite intense due to droughts and also the previous 5 years of droughts, but also specifically heat waves. And if you look at across the board in our cellar, where we work with a lot of Grenache, some Syrah, Carignan, Cinsault and Pinotage, then across the board, the pH levels of all these Grenache vineyards are the best, in my opinion. So it tells us something about the vintage and the reality of a dry region. It requires much less water than Syrah, which is also, some people speak about eco-farming for the future. If you think of less water, of warm slopes, I mean, in the southern hemisphere, we plant mostly on east, north, or western slopes. And in the Swartland, I mean, we have a few special sites in terms of altitude, but I mean, taking my neighbor into consideration, we've got much more altitude than altitude. It's something that we have in our region where it's from, I would like to say 50 up to 500 meters of sea level. So it's a huge variation in soils. It's mostly granite in the southeast, which is the corner in the right-hand corner in the bottom. We get a lot of shales in the east, Porseleinberg, where the Molyneux are based, which is the Kasteelberg on the north, well, in the east. In the west, we have a lot of clay. Clay is basically all over the region, but it varies in depth. We have a huge red iron influence. In Afrikaans, we speak of koffieklip, which is gravel. That varies in depths, it varies in intensities, and we also get a few limestone pockets, which is quite interesting to explore in our region. Similarities we have in terms of the Southern Rhône is, I think, for many years, and I would like to say Priorat in one way as well, and the Roussillon and Culs, where historically a lot of bold, big alcoholic extracted wines were made. And I think there's a shift towards away from power, but more to elegance. There's nothing against power, but I think it comes with, let's say, power with grace, power with elegance, and not power with huge high alcohols of 15, 16, 17 alcohol, where it actually burns your palate or your sensation. So there's been a very interesting shift. East, Spanish, Mediterranean, the Catalan, Southern Rhône, the Swartland, I mean, our region has been known for big alcoholic reds historically. This interesting, the Atlantic Ocean on the west of the Swartland, it's quite far from us, but it does allow the heat to escape, which makes for a good diurnal shift, day-night temperatures. Having said that, we've seen it in May, we've seen it every year in winter. We have a few warm days, which actually does disturb the vine shutdown. We've seen a bit of premature budding from these heat waves in our winter, and also a lack of rainfall for that argument. But during vintage, sometimes we start with the heat waves, sometimes during the vintage or thereafter, we have 1 or 2 heat waves where at midnight it's around 35 degrees Celsius, and then nothing cools down. So it's basically part of the vintage we have to deal, and we've had extremes and we've had better vintages, and it shows. And that's the argument and the reason why I believe in multiple pickings, whether it's one single vineyard or not. I'll definitely take a spread risk. It's much more work we do. I mean, we do a bit more than 100 tons in our cellar, and of that, we do almost 60 pickings. So it's a lot of different pickings we do just to make sure that we can pick before, and sometimes we have to pick during, but also thereafter in terms of a heat wave.
David, just a quick interruption. I'd be interested to know the difference. How many days on average would your harvest be versus, say, Louis? How long would your harvest at Saint-Côme be for the 15 hectares? What would the differences be?
I pick my 15 hectares of Gigondas in about 10, 12 days.
Okay. And David, what are you at?
We work with about 30 days, which is including Chenin Blanc being the earliest. Pinotage, which is actually the first grape we start with, which is the red component for the red blend. And we finish with Cinsault in our region. The very first year when I picked Grenache in the Langkloof, which is the shortest valley, but called Long Valley, in the middle of the Paardeberg, the farm owner, he told me that I'm crazy to pick in February because historically he only used to pick in March. And every year when he tastes my wine, he says the wine is green and he doesn't like it. And so I'm taking it with a nip of salt because I know historically that's the way the big red wines were made in our region. It was, you never pick these red wines, and even Pinotage, you don't pick in January like we do. You would pick an earlier ripener like Pinotage, middle of Feb, and even later. So it's obviously worlds apart from what we're trying to do. Not to say we dismiss the past, but yeah, on average, it's about 4 weeks, 4 good weeks.
Yeah. Because the other very interesting thing for me, and having both of you on the screen, we're talking about age of vines, and you've got Louis that's looking at us from France. And I think one of the things that they're so spoilt with when Louis, let's say, arrives at the estate in 1992 is to terroir, where there are vines that are old. And here you are planting new vines for that next generation that hopefully gets old. David, so these young Grenache vines in particular, what's your take on the potential quality that young Grenache vines can generate? I'm not talking about a wine that'll be tasty and drinkable, but something really serious from 5 or 6 year old vines. I mean, you're obviously sort of in the middle of it, but what is your take on young vine Grenache generating something special?
So we work with, I think it's 9 registered old vine project or Chenin Blanc vineyards. Let's say on the white side, being my background, we've got a good selection of 40, 50, 60-year-old Chenin Blanc vineyards, and we've seen the reality of old vines versus young vines. On the Grenache side, I always joke about it, and I tell people that I also studied viticulture because I also have to imply and implement my studies. And that's where it comes in terms of Grenache. It's not an easy grape to farm when it's young. It can yield way too much grapes, and then you unexpected, or if you don't, if you're not aware of that, in terms of the yield for the vintage, it will basically destroy your complete vintage in terms of cellar space. So we do what we do for the Grenache young plantings. It's warm slopes, high radiation, obviously dry land farmed, cover crops to soak up a bit of the moist. This year we're going to do on the one specific vineyard an experiment to keep the cover crops longer in the soil to absorb some of the moist and to see the reaction of that. A Vert Vendange, a green vintage, and obviously pruning for quality, making sure you prune for that, and you can't have lush circumstances in which you grow. So when you look at nitrogen as an example, compost versus nitrogen elements of these vineyards, that's also an important factor. And then On the young vineyards this year, we did a Blanc de Noir picking at around 17 barley, more or less. So we've got a beautiful rosé in our cellar, mostly Grenache. And then we did the second picking. Actually, if you take the green picking in context or in consideration, then it's the third picking. So needless to say, there's a lot of work involved. It's only our third picking really that we get the quality and the concentration that we desire. And from that, we're quite positive. But it doesn't go without a lot of work, which is much more work than any of our, let's say, older vineyards is. And that's the reality of Grenache. It's a farmer's grape in our region, and I wish we had more of that in our region, where if you paid someone based on a ton of grapes, then pay him based on Cinsault and Pinotage in a way, but definitely Grenache and Cinsault, because the yields are amazing. And in our country, we've got 3 clones, and the old clone is an Antwerp clone, which is the 70. And it's been quite recent, I think 5 years recently, or the last 5 years, where we had 513 and 1064 clones coming in. I'm a very skeptical person. I don't redesign the wheel. I'm not a pioneer in that way. So I'm working with only the 70, which is the old clone known for mass production, but we do graft them onto poor, let's say low vigor rootstocks, and also average to low potential soils. We've got a few in the Swartland. If you look at soil potential out of 10 to yield good fruit, it probably needs to be 3, 4, or maybe 5 out of 10. Otherwise, you stimulate too much growth, then you have too much vigor, and it will be green.
No, that's a good one. I'm just gonna while you maybe finish off there, David, I'm just gonna mention to everyone that's watching is to maybe I'm just also looking at the time just to throw 1 or 2 questions out. I see that there's Louis. I don't know if you have been following the chat, but and David, you'll be happy to see that lots of people are drinking your wines tonight, and a variety of vintages and different cuvées. I see some Leclos. I haven't seen a Hominis Fides yet, but I know that there's not a lot of it. And yeah, Louis, David was mentioning the water thing, which is something very topical for South Africa. Oh, what's that? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
That's far too young. You can't drink
that's
that.
why I'm not opening it.
Too young. But one of the big issues in South Africa is obviously water, Louis, and we've had a few years of very serious drought, which has been very difficult for David and some of the other wine farmers, especially where they're based. I mean, water in Gigondas for you is absolutely no problem. The vines, you've never had sort of water issues, or what's the sort of situation there?
No, in the past, it happens that we had very, very dry vintages, but with global warming, it happens. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, perfect. It happens more and more. I mean, in 30, 40 years ago, there would be one very dry year every 15 years, something like that. We had 2 or 3 of them in the last 10, 12 years. Wow. So there is an acceleration, obviously, and we worry about that. I mean, it's worrying. It's coming. So maybe we are a little bit more fortunate because we still have quite a good amount of water, but we see it changing rapidly.
But Louis, you have something like, let's say, recently 2019, which everyone knows pretty much in most regions in France. It's a hot vintage, Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhône, but it seems like all the best producers were still able to make wines that, let's say, didn't show the heat, and they are still, I mean, it's a big generalization, but broadly elegant and somehow have rolled with the punches and haven't, let's say, reflected that absolute heat of the vintage. And do you think that that's maybe relates back to the viticulture or the age of the vines, or Well, I don't know if there's some particular reasoning, if you agree with that.
It's difficult to give a general answer to that, because you will cross winemakers who deal much better than others with the challenges. One. Secondly, I believe that the vines, there is an adaptation of the vines. In 2003, when we got this terribly dry and hot vintage, I think the vines got this by surprise. And as they get more and more of them, I think somewhere they get used to it. Any vegetal will show an adaptation to climate change. I believe in that. So one of the symptoms is the crops which go down. I don't know. It's really difficult to give a reliable answer on that.
Okay. Now, I think it's quite an interesting, because it almost doesn't make sense. I mean, how some of the wines haven't reflected necessarily the excesses in heat, which is a good thing.
Yeah, you see, for example, if you get dryness and the bunches lose water, you concentrate everything. So you concentrate maybe sugar, but you concentrate acids as well. And in those dry vintages, depending on how the dryness happens, you can end up with a really good, relatively low pHs. And you eventually end up with wines with a lot of intensity, but a good freshness as well, which is paradoxal.
Yeah.
I don't know what David thinks about that.
That's a very interesting paradox, and we've seen the same. We've in our region since 15 winter going on to 16, we've seen the real challenge of having very small rainfall, or let's say small rains. On average, our region is known for about 500 millimeters of rain, and for the past 5-6 years, we had anything from 200 up to 350 mils of rain. So it's been a huge challenge. And you can adapt in our region in two ways: by planting different varieties or other varieties, and to do the experimentation around it, which is happening, which is good. For us, we basically decided to work much more with Grenache than ever before. So that was our, let's say, answer to working with in a warmth and in a dry region that gets drier and warmer every year, to adapt to that. And also, I mean, you're farming organically, and we're doing a lot of experimentation around biological farming, which is not biodynamic, it's not organically certified at all, but it's a step away from conventional farming. And people will shoot me for using the word conventional farming, because there is a place for that and it's also needed. But for us, we farm about 20 hectares in total. It's low density planting. It's about 3,000 to 3,500 vines per hectare. We've moved away from herbicides and pesticides, and we've basically invested a lot of money in just restoring root and soil life and getting that happening and going again, which is the first priority for us in terms of adapting to droughts. So we've seen, not from that, but we've seen during the droughts, interesting pH and total acidity that basically was a paradox to the complete vintage. 2019 was a very good example of that, where we actually saw high malic acid levels, and then after malolactic fermentation, we had amazing acid levels in total, where we assumed at that stage that we would have a big dropout due to that.
Do you think Cinsault has an interesting future in your area because of these temperature rise?
I do think so, but I work with both Cinsault and Pinotage, and I see that, I mean, I used to work with Pinot Noir as well, to put it into context, the 3 varieties. Cinsault and Pinotage got a very, very high pH, which is a big challenge. I mean, I pick a 12 alcohol, I pick a middle of January. Other regions make base wine for sparkling wine in the middle of January. I pick red wine, pinotage in the middle of January, and still get relatively high pHs. So that and Cinsault, the fact that you can easily have a 3.5 up to 4 pH is a big challenge in my opinion, because it goes without necessarily the right acid. So dry regions, I mean, historically our region was full of Cinsault, a lot of pinotage as well. But if you want to make, let's say, corrected or commercialized wine, you need to have a bag of acid and a lot of recipes. And then, in my opinion, sterile filter, because the high acid or the high pH will be a risk in bottle if you do not have a very clean and safe protocol in terms of your cellar's hygiene. So for me, I would prefer to work with Grenache. We've seen call it a revolution in terms of the last 5 or 7 or 10 years in Cinsault. It's happened recently with pinotage as well, where people actually do pinotage in a more Beaujolais style. I mean, our own style it's part that, but it's not 100% carbonic. But these varieties that were previously neglected in a way out of a, let's say, a new generation viewpoint, because initially it was only Syrah. That was the new variety for the young generation that focused on, and for good reasons, because some of the best countries and our best wines in our country is made from Syrah, from the younger generation, in my opinion. But Cinsault, pinotage, and Grenache definitely getting a second wave and a second ride. And yeah, again, just summarizing pH for me, I would rather focus on Grenache long term for dry and warm regions.
Yeah, David, I think we must organize some pinotage cuttings to send to Louis to plant in just outside the house there, or the chapel. But Louis, I've had a few questions on my phone and on the side, and I know that it's a very long discussion, but maybe we can just do a quick summary, if you wouldn't mind, because I'm also watching the time. Is always the discussion of sort of organics and the biodynamic viticulture. And I know that you've got your opinions on that, and I think it's very, very interesting. So in terms of the vineyards, I think you broadly organic, but then the biodynamics, there's certain principles that don't work with your philosophies, or maybe you can elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, when you work organically for such a long time, you go further and further in the soil understanding, in the use of pruning relatively to the moon, and using those ancient methods that were used before chemical products arrived in the agriculture. I mean, all these good methods come from the times when people had no chemicals and they had to manage production with very few tools. So it's very, very interesting. And you go further and further. I began to work biodynamically in 2009. And I had the help of one of the guys from Demeter, one of the top guys of Demeter. And I began to use the silica on the vines at the beginning of the summer, and I rapidly thought it was a nonsense in hot climates. And I said I don't want to do that. It has a very negative effect, especially on the old vines. And the problem is silica is part of the preparations you have to spray if you want to certify biodynamically. And I said, this is a nonsense. And the guy said, oh, you can do it in winter, then it will have no effect and you can certify. So I said, but then you ask me to lie to people and just to have the decoration like a Soviet general, you know? And so I said, this is when our roads go different ways. So I still work, I still use a lot of the biodynamic ideas, and I use other ideas that are not considered biodynamic. But I think the certification designed I mean, the same way for Champagne and Roussillon is a nonsense, because you talk about two very different viticultures and climate and grapes and so on. And frankly, this is bullshit. So I will never certify biodynamic for this reason, because I refuse to go for bad ideas just to be part of a trendy group. But yes, I use many of these methods. But for me, the important certification is the organic certification. This is to really deliver the message that you go clean, you go alive soils, you go biodiversity, you go with all these fundamental ideas.
That's awesome. No, thanks for that. And one of the other ones, Louis, because I'm actually just managing the time. Someone's also asked us what your preference is in terms of the evolution of your Gigondas wines, whether it's the straight Gigondas or the single vineyards. When do you like to when do you recommend to sort of drink these wines? Obviously, there's vintage variation, but let's say in a less powerful vintage versus a powerful vintage, what are sort of the timelines you think is a good time to drink?
It's interesting. It works like if Saint-Côme wines have a biological clock. It doesn't matter if it's a difficult vintage or a great vintage or a Lieu-dit wines or the Gigondas Classic. The good time to begin to drink is 10 years. And it applies to every vintage. I didn't decide that. This is just the way it works. So for example, at the moment, what begins to taste really well is 9, 8, 7, 10 is still a little young, okay? And the older ones, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2099, are really beautiful. But yeah, it's how it works. So if people want to drink these wines before they are 10, they better drink Deux Albions or other wines, whatever other things. But yeah, it's a bit of a shame to drink them too young.
David, that's your lecture from Louis, direct from France. You're not allowed to touch the Hominis Fides 16 until 2026 at least.
I'll come and hopefully he'll open a 99 when I visit him next year.
Yeah, it's something that's drinking really nice.
This is what I was gonna say.
Would love to.
And Louis, last question, because I'm trying to get everyone's questions in, and maybe it's also a short one. Someone just wanted to know the very, very basic, simple differences between the Clos, the Laposte, and the Hominis Fides. If you can just do a very quick difference between the three.
Very quickly, this is all very, very close. 300 meters max at the most, but three very different soils. Laposte is pure Tortonian soil. Le Clos has a component of Tortonian, but this is more Miocene, more limestone. And Hominis is sand. Limestone is sands from the Miocene Sea. So it's all limestoney. It's all very Saint-Côme, but still very, very different.
And the Hominis is the oldest vineyards of the three?
No, this is Le Clos. Le Clos was planted in 1870.
1870, okay. So just, David, that's what you got to work towards, 1870, that sort of difference, that sort of age of vines. Huh?
That sounds reasonable.
Louis and David, I'd love to carry on chatting, but as I say, we've learned from the previous ones, everyone's got to look after children and cook dinner and things like that. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to end off with, but from a Great Domains point of view, it's we know that it does take time, even though you're at home and doing it from the comfort of your own chairs and homes and lounge. We really appreciate your time and input, and it's been brilliant. So thanks so much to the two of you.
Only a pleasure, and yeah, thanks Louis. It's a big privilege for us. Thanks Derek and for the team. It's been an amazing 1 hour session. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks to you, our great importers, and all the amateurs who support our job. Without the amateurs, we wouldn't even exist. And yeah, it was a wonderful time to share with you all. And David, I cannot wait to spend some time here in the Southern Rhône, and yeah, we'll have good fun with old wines and among other things.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you very
And
much.
Louis, just remember, we're still going to get you to South Africa, and we've promised to take you to a rugby game. So that's still going to happen. We're not travel again.
Yeah, please.
I'm looking forward to it, and yeah, have a good evening that side, and we'll be in touch. Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Derek.
Bye.
Bye.